singing that for us. We knew you were singing it, but we couldn't hear you. So if you could unmute yourself next time, that would be great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, do ask me next time.
This is a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Our gospel reading this morning, I think it's helpful to have, as usual, to have some context about why Jesus is talking about welcoming in this particular spot. And you have to go back to the 9th chapter of Matthew to really get a feel for what's going on here. And in the 9th chapter of Matthew, Jesus goes about healing and casting out demons and teaching and proclaiming the good news. And in chapter 9, he's really busy and he's all over the place. And the chapter ends with this verse that's familiar to us. "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." And the very next verse, the beginning of chapter 10, says, "Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples, gave them authority over unclean spirits, and he sends them out to do all the things that he had just shown them how to do." He had just given this great demonstration of what it meant to go out into the world, and then he immediately sends his disciples out. And a lot of chapter 10 is instructions for what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to go out there. And these are things that are familiar to us. He says, don't take a heavy pack, travel light. And he says, if you're not welcome, shake the dust off your feet. He says to the disciples in chapter 10, "I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves." And he says, "Beware, you'll be handed over to authorities. But if you are, the Spirit will guide you." And he says, "Do all the things that I was doing. Imitate me. Do everything I showed you in the 9th chapter of Matthew." And he says to them, "Proclaim, or have no fear as you proclaim the good news." And he goes on to say, "I have not come to bring peace, but the sword. And take up your cross and follow me." And then finally, we get to this end of chapter 10. For today, we read, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me." So this part about welcoming follows logically on what Jesus has been doing and talking about with his disciples. And it sounds like, the disciples have their marching orders. And it's going to be a perilous journey. And of course, as we've been talking about, we have our marching orders as well. We are summoned, just like these disciples, to go out into the world and proclaim Christ. We are the hands and feet and voice of Jesus in our world. And part of what it means to proclaim Christ is also to receive Christ, to welcome Christ, to welcome others. As we do that, we are welcoming Jesus as well. So our marching orders today emphasize welcome. And as we are welcomed, so we are called to welcome others. And even more, we're called to welcome others as we would welcome Jesus into our lives. And in order to do that, we need to recognize that the other is Jesus for us. Your neighbors, my neighbors, are the hands and feet of Christ, the voice of Christ in our world. And it's not just the people that we think obviously bring the good news to the world. It's really everyone. Everyone is our neighbor. The person living next door, yes, but even more, the one on the other side of the world who speaks a different language and lives in a different culture, or the one on the other side of the political aisle. Our neighbor is the tourists that come every year to the BV. Our neighbor is the COVID patient in the hospital. Our neighbor is the people that demonstrate and protest for Black Lives Matter. George Floyd is our neighbor. Elijah McClain is our neighbor, and all the others that we've been hearing about. Even the looters and those who are destroying property, all these people are our neighbor. And they bring, in some way, they bring the presence of Christ, even if they don't know it or we can't see it. As they are created in the image of God, they bring the presence of Christ with them. And we are called to welcome them as we would welcome Jesus. They might be proclaiming the good news and we might not recognize it. Or we may disagree with them with all of our being. Or we may not understand them. We might not like them. We may be disgusted or repulsed or frightened or confused by them. And these are the ones that we are called to welcome. We are called to welcome them as we would welcome Jesus. And this kind of welcome is not a casual thing. I think we need to attend to how we welcome other people into our lives. It requires an attitude, a good attitude of openness and receptiveness. It requires some planning. It requires some goodwill, some generosity, and perhaps even extravagance. We can celebrate a guest as the guest comes into our life. We can welcome people with curiosity about who they are and how that image of God is reflected in them. And we can create a safe place or a sanctuary. We can provide a refuge for those whom we are called to welcome. Welcoming our neighbor requires some work and some intention. And we're not called to change them or fix them or fight them or even agree with them, but just to be with them, to invite them, to welcome them. And we can do that by listening and hearing what they have to say, by empathizing, by loving, seeking to understand them, praying with and for them, sharing God's love. And in these COVID days, when we can't welcome in person, maybe there is something we can do, like providing a meal or writing a card. To know the Christ within the other and create a dwelling place in our hearts for that Christ in the other is what we're called to do, just as we welcome Christ into our souls. And great spiritual teachers talk about creating a sanctuary in your soul, a place where you can welcome God, an intentional place of coming together and preparing to meet with God and welcoming Christ into your soul. And when you think about our church sanctuary, where we haven't been able to be lately, it's one place we usually go when we want to meet with God. But we don't need to go there. Even if it's a place of beauty, a place of holiness and quiet and anticipation, we can welcome God into our souls. God is there and here as well. So we create a sanctuary in our soul. And the word sanctuary carries the meaning of holiness and fullness and a place of waiting for God. So we are about welcoming by creating a sanctuary in our souls where we meet with God. We are wakeful and watching and holding a vigil as the Holy Spirit comes to us. We can do that and create a place of beauty within ourselves, of quiet, of anticipation, helping us to remember that God is present all the time. This is a time to prepare that sanctuary, to build a sanctuary in your soul. And think about how you would furnish it. What would you put in there? What symbols would be important to you? How would God be present? How would you be in that place? And what would you do there? God is waiting earnestly hoping for us to prepare that place. So you can ask yourself, how are you doing this morning with the sanctuary in your soul? How are you doing welcoming God into your life? Is Christ invited into your heart? Is Christ expected to show up? Will you have to awkwardly move things out of the way and make room at the table when Jesus walks into your heart? How's the conversation going? Are there polite smiles and sideways glances? Or you're wondering how long this guest will stay? Will there be a sigh of relief when you think that your guest is leaving? So what kind of welcome will Christ get in the sanctuary in your soul? That welcome of Christ requires an attitude of openness. It requires some planning, some goodwill, that curiosity, and extravagant celebration. So the question this morning for us is, can we welcome Christ into that sanctuary in our souls? And can we welcome our neighbor like we would welcome Jesus, even the ones that we don't like or understand or that frighten us? Can we build a sanctuary in our hearts and minds for all of our neighbors? Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. When Jesus said that, he realized that we have to practice on each other. We have to practice our welcome on the neighbors that we know and love so that we can welcome the neighbors that we don't know and do a good job of it. This calls us to think about how we see each other and the fundamental nature of the other as the image of God. It's easier to see the presence of God in our own lives when we recognize it in others. From our welcome of Christ, we learn how to truly welcome others. And as we welcome others, we learn how to welcome Christ. Welcoming strangers, welcoming each other, this is a reflection of how we welcome Christ into our hearts. Our welcome of Christ in our lives informs how we welcome, honor, and celebrate others. And finally, Jesus promises us, whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of the disciple, truly I tell you, none of you will lose your reward. Amen.